Hello, all you fine X-Wing people. It's me, Nick, back again to talk about everyone's favourite format, X-Wing 2.5, the AMG edition of the game, which was never controversial. Everyone loved it, and it's the game we still play today, and it will never die because it's the best. But in all seriousness, yes, this is the third of the rule set videos I'm making where we have a brief overview, look at the positives from each rule set. We started out with a retrospective of first edition, and the conversation around second edition is what kind of rules should we look at potentially reintroducing, look at the positives from that, and we're going to have a look at the positives from 2.5. And yes, elephant in the room, obviously 2.5. Is the reason that a lot of people aren't playing the game right now. It was a very fundamental break in the ethos. People often question the care and intent from AMG when they made X-Wing 2.5. And that's not what this video is about necessarily, but we're more interested in looking at the key things and, extrapolating the positives out of it and kind of just going from there. Like the 2.0 video, no, this is not a call to solidify 2.5 and make it rigid and this is the game the XWA should be supporting from now on. No, I think there is nuance. I think there is a good middle ground to strike. And although I do admittedly like the 2.0 system better than 2.5, as a lot of older players do, I don't think a full rollback is necessary or even desirable at this point. Like it or not, there's lots of X-Wing players who have been around the game for a long time that prefer various systems. Plenty of older players still prefer 2.5. And we also have a lot of newer players who have started the game within the last couple of years and have only played 2.5. I made a video back when 2.5 was originally implemented and we had a look at the pros and cons of it. And my biggest takeaway, my biggest criticism of 2.5 at the time was I don't feel like it was a necessary change that had to be made. And for better or for worse, no matter the quality of any major rule set change, it always tests your audience. You're always asking something of people when you fundamentally change things. And I don't think it was necessary, and that was needlessly harmful to the game at the time. And we don't solve that issue by doubling down and making the same mistake AMG did. The last thing X-Wing needs right now is another major rules change, even if it's one that we've already used in the game. I just want to make that point very, very clear. And apart from all that, just want to remind people, if you want to act like a scruffy-looking nerf herder in the comments and just attack people for liking things that you don't like, well, I would just encourage you to grow up and leave. You don't have to watch YouTube videos. You should go outside and focus about the more positive things on life. There's really more important things that we should be getting angry about, not little plastic spaceships. I do love the game, but realistically, hostility doesn't help anyone. Really want to make that point very clear. One more thing as well, I'm just going to get the negativity out of the way first. I'm not going to waste any time in this video sort of trying to defend the 2.5 point system, the list building structure. I identify ship points and loadouts and that sort of overly simplified 20 point system as one of the key things that drove people away from X-Wing. I don't think it's helpful for me to defend it. I will say though, at this point in time, we do have a points update, a beta points update from the XWA, and things are looking very, very positive. It looks like a great compromise within this system to sort of bring it back to the ethos, the thinking where it was in 2.0. Now, I'm not going to spend any time in this video going over that. There's a lot of things I want to talk about. Indeed, I want to sort of talk about the ethos behind how we build lists, how we value certain game pieces, sort of the attitudes of AMG and, the hero wingification, the Marvel Crisis protofolification of X-Wing. That's a whole thing to unpack in itself. But with all that out of the way, I'd like to talk about a few key things from 2.5 that's worth seriously looking at and I think building on and improving on. Because even if the implementation was bad, I think there actually are some really good key ideas that AMG brought to the table. So let's do it. Let's get our 1.5 range rulers out and play some hero wing. All right, first up, let's have a chat about scenario play. So in X-Wing 2.0, we just did dogfighting with a symmetrically balanced list. In 2.5, we had scenario play where you try to capture points, you try to capture certain items on the gaming table, hold onto them and score points that way. And this offered way more unique gameplay. It also prevented fortressing in how your ships move and how your ships hoard points as well. Basically, in the current version of the game, not going for objectives is fairly detrimental. So I had a chat in the last video about dogfighting, and I think mechanically within the game of X-Wing, dogfighting is very clean, very chess-like is the phrase I used back then. It ultimately is a great test of skill between you and your opponent, as long as we try to get the value of ships, pilots, and upgrades within the game, as long as it's as balanced as possible. Dogfighting is just a clean test of skills. With scenario play, things become a bit more interesting. We avoid things like points fortressing, and we create a lot more unique scenarios for us to play in. So rather than focusing on, like practiced moves, like exactly what kind of speeds you need to get down the board to hit your opponent range 2 or 3 or whatever, you're forced to engage with the board state in a much more complex way. It's more about how you strategize than doing like repeated play patterns. Which I think is an excellent thing. Now, my criticism of the way it was done, if we have a look at the various scenarios AMG made, we're talking about holding points by being near a beacon. You actually have to pick up tokens and hold them on your ship, and if your ship suffers a critical, you drop it and all that kind of stuff. And it all just felt a bit odd. I felt like the scenarios that AMG put into the game feel very gamified, and they don't necessarily gel with what we sort of expect these little plastic ships to do. The great thing about dogfighting was because the scenario was so simplistic, the ships, the mechanics of the game, the core game loop was able to take over. And that was a great way of increasing immersion. The problem when you have scenario play and it doesn't represent something that the ships would generally do. It feels like they're literally playing a game of capture the flag in a symmetrical arena, which just doesn't really make sense with X-Wing ships. The one that always got me was the scenarios where you have to pick up a token with your ship and hold it. Because spaceships don't do that. They don't have metal arms that come out and grab things. Like, I know there are times within the Star Wars lore, I want to say in the Rebels show, where the Ghost has opened up its airlock, its gangway, and like sort of scooped up things in midair. But it's not that's not really the same thing we're talking about. That's like you have to snatch a valuable prisoner as they escape a capital ship, or that kind of stuff. What we're sort of playing around with feels like dodgeball or capture the flag. Again, it's very gamified, it's very symmetrical, and yeah, it feels sport-like. And for the longest time, I was sort of scratching my head as to why this was the way that things were implemented. And I'm not going to go too far into detail into this next point in this particular video, but once you start to play the game Marvel Crisis Protocol, you really do start to understand what's going on here. Now, I want to stress this point. I love Marvel. It's a great game. But those mechanics are appropriate for that game. They built the game around that way of thinking. And in X-Wing, it just feels cut and pasted. And more to the point, the core components of X-Wing don't really suit this kind of gameplay. The setup is a little bit janky. You had to measure like half of a notch on a range ruler. They actually ended up making 1.5 range rulers, and they put them in store kits. Thank you to the kind person that sent me this, by the way, in case you're watching. Really appreciate that. So without dwelling too much on the inherent problems of this, let's look at scenario play and really ask the question, does it belong in X-Wing? Because I think the answer is actually yes. I think scenario play is key, but there's a few important things that moving forward that we have to look at to make sure it's done properly. First of all, the focus should not be taken away from dogfighting. Now, I argue it wasn't taken away as much as a lot of people say. There was I don't want to say a knee-jerk reaction when 2.5 first came out, but I think a lot of very untested opinions were being thrown around back then. That's fine. People are entitled to their opinions. But as someone who has played all versions of X-Wing and Marvel Crisis Protocol, I don't really think that dogfighting was taken out of it so much per se, but still too far, in my opinion. I think at the end of the day, when you're, doing your X-Wing thing, dogfighting should be a legitimate strategy. You should be able to go, hey, I can't really do this scenario, but I can try and blow my opponents out of the sky. And let's be realistic, in most situations within Star Wars, starfighter fighting of sorts, that'll usually be fine. You'll usually still win at that point. So depending on how the XWA wants to look at this, whether that's weighting the points further towards just, the way you score with damaging and destroying ships, whether scoring changes as you chase objectives, whether scoring changes based on certain things within the game, like there are scenarios where named pilots actually do offer up more points if you kill them because, I don't know, they're relevant to what is going on in the story. But I think the key thing, apart from all that, is making sure these actually feel like scenarios that happen within Star Wars media, because I don't think AMG achieved that at all. Now, if we look at the various examples of starfighter battles within Star Wars, basically none of them were just straight dogfights. I think I can think of one where basically it was a few ships versus a few ships, and the goal of both parties was to destroy the other ships. Indeed, if we think of the most iconic dogfight in Star Wars, in my opinion, the Battle of Yavin, it absolutely was not a straight dogfight. It was about the rebels trying to achieve a certain goal within a certain time period. Now, it was great that AMG did bring out the pack, the Battle of Yavin pack, and sort of gave us that kind of scenario play. If I don't bring that up, people are going to mention it in the comments. But the regular competitive dogfighting scenarios that we go and play in real tournaments didn't reflect that. And I think, honestly, those are the most important things. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think we have to put up with scenarios that do fundamentally take away so much from dogfighting and so much from that competitive element from the game. I don't want to see scenarios add a whole heap of RNG. I still want X-Wing to fundamentally be a test of skill. I'm sorry to the more casual players. I know a lot of people get bothered by some of the high-end play and specifically a lot of the elements from 2.0, but I realistically think there needs to be a ceiling on RNG and a way we can sort of learn and play into scenarios so high-level play is rewarded. I think that's something that was lost from the game, and scenarios were partially because of that. I do love the introduction of scenario play. I just want to point that out. And I do acknowledge that I'm not offering any real solutions. I just want to make sure that we are well aware of the issue with scenario play so we can move forward with them. In fact, if any of you watching have any ideas on what kind of scenarios we could do, what kind of scenarios would work in the competitive X-Wing game, not just like special store events, not just something that needs a bunch of special components, something that we can sort of do and repeat within regular X-Wing that fundamentally feels like X-Wing. It feels like a Star Wars starfighter battle. All right, let's talk about bumping. There's a lot to unpack here. So bumping in 2.5 got a lot more complicated than it was in 2.0. And the fundamental ethos as to why this happened was it was identified as a major negative play experience within 1.0 and 2.0. Basically, the way it used to work was you bump into a ship, any ship at all, your ship, your opponent's ship. Your ship cannot take any actions. If it did a red maneuver, it still takes a stress, but it doesn't get to reorient its ship like it would if it completed it. And it cannot shoot the ship it is touching during combat. It can still shoot other ships though. A lot of people identified this as a major negative play experience. Now, I already spoke to that in the last video. Please watch that if you haven't already, because I fundamentally don't agree with that. However, I do think there are some positives from what AMG implemented here. Because fundamentally, from a flavor point of view, they didn't really break anything. Yes, you can shoot at range 0 and you can only do certain actions when you bump, but that still represents a hampering of pilots as they're trying to avoid each other in 3D space. That's fundamentally what's going on. In 1.0 and 2.0, it's kind of like, well, they're just, they're basically flying over each other at that point when they're touching during combat, so they couldn't shoot each other. It's kind of the same thing, but it's like they're trying to clip each other as they go past and just get a weak shot off. Remember, at range 0, you actually roll one less dice as well, and you can't modify dice. Originally, I believe AMG allowed you to use force to modify dice, but they got rid of that as well. They really wanted to make sure you couldn't do that. And I don't hate that overall. I like being able to force a bump to prevent your opponent from shooting as a tactic in your tool belt. This rule change did harm aces. It did harm large ships as well. It doesn't get to prevent multiple shots at once. You know, a large ship can often bump into multiple things at once. It's large and in charge. It's going to do that. And I think in an effort to eliminate negative play experience, sort of appease the more beer and pretzels crowd, the casual crowd, it did sort of add some unnecessary RNG, and it took away from a great benefit of high-level play. There are some positives here, though. They did alter what happens when you bump into your friendly ships as opposed to your opponent's ship. When you bump into your friendly ships, you can actively take damage. And this is something that can be used to prevent fortressing. Fantastic. It does have an additional downside, unfortunately, because swarms often do accidentally bump into each other, or they kind of do utilize bumping as a way to sort of like bunch together and get around rocks and that kind of stuff. It is a legitimate strategy. However, when I say that as well, I also think, well, it's kind of weird that you can change the speed of your ships by intentionally flying in front of them. It doesn't make sense from a flavor point of view. I understand that. I think addressing the way friendly ships bump into each other and utilizing that as a sort of tactic to actively slow down the game, I actually like that there was a real effort to hamper that. I like that that was recognized, and I actually want to praise AMG for doing that. I think there are byproducts of that, and I think the XWA would benefit from looking at the negatives that were caused by this, specifically the way it punishes swarms, and try and do something about that. I don't know what that is. I'm sorry. Again, I don't really have a solution for that. It's very complicated if you think about. The best solution may end up being just scrapping this entirely, because we're sort of putting a band-aid on a band-aid on a band-aid. At some point, it just becomes way too cumbersome. In terms of the way enemy ships bump into each other now, I find the whole idea of being able to shoot at range 0 with a disadvantage interesting. I do want to propose something here. I actually want to offer some kind of solution rather than just muse over these various rulings, because big ships do get punished for bumping into smaller ships or setting up blocks on smaller ships. What if, here's the thought, what if you could shoot at range 0, but only smaller sized ships? Think about it for a second. So you're flying a gauntlet fighter. Your opponent's coming at you with an A-wing and a TIE fighter, a rebel TIE fighter, so they can be on the same faction. Which of those ships should fly out of the way? If that group of ships playing chicken, who do you think's gonna turn first? It ain't the gauntlet fighter. The gauntlet fighter is something that can carve its way through squadrons. Same with larger freighters, same with like fire sprays if it's coming up against snub fighters. I think from a flavor perspective, that really makes a lot of sense. And it also detracts from that whole problem. You could make the argument that it makes blocking too powerful for larger ships. So obviously, this isn't something I've actively tested, so take it with a grain of salt. But I think, you know, trying to brainstorm these creative ways of actually representing what's really going on in a dogfight, really appreciate what happens when massive ships come up against small ships, and try to represent that in some way that feels fair and actually addresses some of the issues that came up from the AMG ruling in 2.5, where basically you can slam all your small ships into a big ship and eviscerate it. Now, before anyone points it out, yes, I know an A-wing destroyed the Executor. I know an ant destroyed an elephant. That wasn't a dogfight. Before you pointed out, that wasn't a dogfight. Flying into the bridge of another ship does not count. Oh, that'd be a cool scenario. Yeah. XWA, do that. At the end of the day, I guess my main thesis when it comes to the way bumping was implemented in 2.5, it ultimately did a good job of addressing some of the key issues brought up by X-Wing players. We just have to be mindful of band-aid patches, because if they cause more issues, when we have to put another band-aid on top of that, and the more of these kinds of patch fixes for the rules we have to do when we start differentiating, well, you bump into this happens, you bump into that happens, as opposed to a clean system where everything's the same, everything becomes more and more cumbersome. And one thing I've always said about X-Wing, especially before 2.5, is it's so accessible, and that's one of the key things that make it great. So we just got to be mindful of that while we're looking at these kinds of things. But fundamentally, I really like a bumping system that does punish fortressing and encourage players to actively advance the board state. All right, there's one more rule system I want to chat about in this video, and that's Road. Road legitimately is something that I thought was going to be terrible. I thought that this was going to be really cumbersome, add a lot of unnecessary RNG into the game, and basically be the epitome of what ruined the game in 2.5. In actual fact, I really like Road. It's surprising, and I think it fundamentally looked at something that people were generally bothered by. It addressed a core issue with the game, which was the negative play experience of the bid system. Although I like the bid system myself, I fully acknowledge that it's clearly something that bothered a lot of people. It's something that a lot of people brought up way back, even in 1.0. And it just ended up being way more intuitive than you think. So just to clarify what I'm talking about here, in 2.0, there was a bid system. You could take up to 200 points on your list. Every point you took below 200 was a bid. The larger bid basically got to choose who went first and second. The first player always had to fly their ships with the same initiative. They had to activate those ships during activation and combat before ships of the same initiative on their opponent's side. If you were flying aces like Fang Fighters, TIE Interceptors, TIE Silencers, things that really heavily lent into repositioning, trying to arc dodge, it was incredibly punishing if you lost a bid by 1 point. And it was like Sunterfell versus Sunterfell. You almost lost the game at that point. Not entirely. You do have agency as a blocker as well, but ultimately it's not what the ship was lending into. It punished a lot of newer players who didn't really follow the meta. And although I do love following the meta myself, I really enjoy engaging with that in high-level play, it's not for everyone, and that's perfectly valid. In 2.5, AMG introduced the road system. From this point forward, the bid was irrelevant. At the start of activation, after you've dialed up your ships, you put your maneuver on the table, you basically roll off with your opponent to randomly select the first player. And not only did that remove the feel bads of always having to fly in a bad order during the course of an X-Wing game because you didn't bid by 1 or 2 extra points, it also added something else, and I think this is the key as to why I love Road. It added in another risk-reward element, where if you're trying to assess what the board state's going to look like as your ships activate, you suddenly had to think about the possibility of your ships activating in one of 2 different orders. And that meant you either had to be really conservative or you had to take big risks when dialing up your ships. And when you learn how to read the way your opponent plays, and you really sink your teeth into that sort of cat and mouse, chess-like engagement with the game, it actually added this really cool strategic element. And that's the key reason why I love Road, because I remember trying it after I found the rules and, sort of reluctantly giving 2.5 a go, looking at my dials, looking at my ships, and thinking about what would happen if I didn't have to worry about Road, and thinking about what happened, what I had to do in that game where, that ship might activate, or that ship might activate during this cycle of the turn. And just running through the scenarios in my head and realizing what that actually added. That RNG element actually forced you to engage more with the board state, not less. It made you have to consider what your opponent was doing more than less. Was your opponent going to take the big risk, or were they going to fly extra conservative? And if they're going to fly conservative either way, can you take the risk to sort of counter that? But are they likely to do that? What's the points look like right now? Is my opponent in a desperate state where they want to take more risks and they want to try and do a big sort of S-loop behind my ship? But are they going to be able to block it because they might get to fly first? I don't know. It's really cool, is essentially what I'm trying to say. And as someone who prefers the old bump system where you don't get to shoot ships at range 0, I actually want to see that old bumping system with Road, or a modified thing, as I mentioned before, where, larger ships can shoot smaller ships, but, aces flying and bumping into each other, not being able to shoot each other. I want to see that alongside Road. The other thing people are sort of playing around with is random order before dials, robbed, if you will. We actually randomize the player order and then you get to dial up your ships. You take away a lot of the risk that way, but it does sort of remove an RNG element, but you still do have to consider that you don't know the order of the ships flying in the next turn, and you still don't have the feel bads of having to deal with the fact that you are always flying in a certain order and you're being punished by that. Both Road ROAD and Robbed ROBD do speak to me a lot, and I think there's a case for both of them. But when it comes to Road and the points and the bumping, these are all interconnected mechanics. We have to consider the way these are changed holistically. Indeed, if you look at 2.5, you can see there is a through line of wanting to remove negative play experiences, and that sort of explains why the certain things happened. Unfortunately, I think it was ultimately done in a way which, as a whole, didn't feel like the same game. It added a bit too much complexity and at times added too much RNG. And those are the key points I wanted to chat about with 2.5. I want to say a huge thank to everyone who commented in the last video. I'm sure this video will be similar. I am actively praising 2.5, so I know it's going to garner some negative comments. Again, I'm going to plead with people not to do that, but they're going to do it anyway, so whatever, drive my engagement, see if I care. But most importantly, I think it's really important that we do have these honest conversations. We do have to face the fact that we may want the game to go a certain way. We want a hard reset to 2.0, or we want to consolidate 2.5. The XWA don't have the luxury of abandoning nuance like that. And I think if we're going to have an intellectually honest conversation about this, we can't either. You might hate 2.5, but I think there's a lot of positive things that did come out of it. And looking right now at what the XWA has already introduced, the changes they're potentially talking about, the rebalancing they've done, the epic elements that they've introduced, don't worry, I'm going to make content on all this stuff. It's just, there's a lot for me to get through right now. Is extremely positive. And I think just throwing up your hands and saying, oh, where's 200 points? You guys should have bought back 200 points. This is pointless. I'm just going to go now. Dumb game. You know, that kind of thinking doesn't help anyone. At the end of the day, that's just your opinion, man. So stay tuned. We're going to have a further conversation about heroing and what that sort of whole ethos did to the game as a whole. I think that's a very interesting conversation to have. In the meantime, is there anything I've missed from 2.5 you think I should be highlighting? Please tell me in the comments. I might make a follow-up video to this if I think there's enough content. Indeed, there's already like 3 other videos on the back of this, just chatting about rules. I could do this for ages. But in the meantime, thank you all who have also been watching the Star Wars Unlimited content. For all you X-Wing fans, it's spoiler season right now. That's why you're seeing all these videos. Look, if it bothers you, please, I just want to encourage you, don't unsubscribe. Just don't engage with those videos. YouTube will stop serving them to you. They have separate tags, the X-Wing ones, so just please be mindful of that. I'd hate to lose subscribers because I'm trying to diversify. That doesn't feel fair to me. But in the meantime, thank you all so much for watching. Come hang out on the Discord, link down in the description. It's basically a free forum where we chat about all this stuff, X-Wing, Star Wars Unlimited, what I'm doing on the channel. I literally have the Discord on this screen right in front of me with all my video notes. It's a good chance for myself to chat with the community, actually discuss these finer points before making these videos. So A, I can be a bit more informed, and B, might be some cool points I didn't think about. So thank you everyone who has contributed to that. In particular, JJ, the massive sort of essay you wrote discussing your thoughts on 2.5 gave me a lot to think about, and I really, really appreciate that. And with that, I'll catch everyone in the next video.